on Iraq. He argues that withdrawing from Iraq will not hurt counterterrorism efforts. Mr. Clarke is introduced by John Podesta of the Center for American Progress at this 50-minute event.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Podesta. I'm the president of the Center for American Progress, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here for the first of our national security events of the new year, a year that our guest, not surprisingly, describes as 007. The title of Dick's talks this morning importantly starts with the words "after Iraq." Tomorrow night, though, President Bush will unveil a plan that will reportedly call for an escalation of the war in Iraq. We're in a different moment than during past speeches from the President on Iraq. Congress now has an important responsibility to assert itself as a co-equal branch of government in shaping the future of our Iraq policy. Last month, the Center for American Progress released a paper calling for a diplomatic surge rather than a military escalation and advocating the ability of Congress, among other actions, to require an up or down vote on an increase in troops in Iraq. Congress should, indeed must, provide funding for the troops that are in Iraq today, but it can condition funding on additional troops. Today, the Center is releasing a report documenting past actions Congresses have taken to place limitations on and requirements for military deployments and funding. Congress has employed several different policy levers, as this memo shows, as it has sought to guide U.S. national security and the deployment of American troops. Some of those policies levers include conditioning, limiting, or shaping the timing and nature of troop deployments and the missions they are authorized to undertake, capping the size of military deployments, and prohibiting funding for existing or prospective deployments. While the President is the Commander-in-Chief, Congress retains the power, with the consent of the President, to establish the laws by which we conduct foreign policy and must decide whether the activities the President is undertaking are deserving of the new resources he's requesting. As some of you may have read this morning, Senator Kennedy will be proposing a resolution today to require that the President return to Congress to seek renewed authorization before embarking on a course of escalating military involvement in Iraq. And I think, as these examples in the memo we're releasing demonstrate, that the President should expect that the Congress can and will shape U.S. policy as it relates to military deployments. So as we consider the next steps in Iraq, I think it's only fitting that we also take a new look at what the Bush administration has called the quote-unquote war on terror, to take stock of how far we've come, but most importantly to recalibrate our focus on the future. Clearly, the war in Iraq has not delivered the security that was promised, and clearly, as we watch events, for example, in Somalia unfold, read reports of a possible attempt to infiltrate the port of Miami, and monitor messages from a still bold and thriving al-Qaeda, we need to rethink our next steps. I can't think of anyone better to frame our challenge and to speak to what we need to do to ensure that America grows safer and more secure than Richard Clarke, our speaker this morning. Dick is well known to most of you, but long before he became known to the American public as the man who put out the warning in the spring of 2001 and throughout that summer, Dick was one of this nation's leading experts on terrorism, homeland security, and cybersecurity. For decades, he toiled behind the scenes as a career member of the Executive Service, who began a lifetime of work on national security in 1973 in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as an analyst on nuclear weapons and European security. Dick served the Reagan administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence, the first Bush administration as Assistant Secretary for Politico-Military Affairs, and was appointed by President Clinton as the first ever National Coordinator for Security, Infrastructure Protection, and Counterterrorism, a position he maintained in the Bush 43 administration. Dick is today the chairman of Good Harbor Consulting and an increasingly prolific author. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, his best-selling book, Against All Enemies, offered the American public an insider's view to the approach of successive administrations to the growing threat posed by terrorists and extremist networks. Although Dick's career has certainly made clear that truth is indeed stranger than fiction, Dick has in recent years become a novelist, publishing The Scorpion's Gate and a second novel, Breakpoint, which will be released, I believe, next week. I had the pleasure, I should say probably the challenge, Dick sometimes is a handful, of working with Dick at the White House. I have to say I learned a great deal from him. Probably I learned more from Dick than any other single person I served with in the White House, including that emails written in bold, bright, capital letters do get people's attention, and I thank Dick for that. He was relentless in his pursuit of our national security, determined to get the job done, and untiring in his commitment. Dick was always fiercely loyal to his staff, and I would say that he has single-handedly mentored a new and impressive generation of some of our best national security experts. And Dick has a good habit of telling the truth to power. That's perhaps the most important job that a presidential aide needs to have, and I think he did that probably with some relish even. But he always told truth to power. Today, commenting on his budding career as a novelist, Dick said that fiction can often tell the truth better than nonfiction. And there's a lot of truth that needs to be told. And so it's my pleasure to invite you, Dick, to tell us the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Clarke.
Thank you, John. You left out my service in the Lincoln and Grant administrations, but well, welcome back after the holidays. We now, unfortunately, have to get back to the task of dealing with national security issues, and we tend always to look, when we do that, at the next day's events. It's particularly appropriate today, since the next day will bring us a speech by the President on Iraq, which is being advertised in advance as an announcement of an escalatory plan. In light of that, I thought it would be useful to step back and ask ourselves, what should we be doing in what the administration calls the global war on terrorism? Not immediately, but when the Iraq war is over. Now, I know that sounds like a strange idea, but only if we cast ourselves into the future and look at the things we ought to be doing in that future can we properly evaluate the near-term decisions that we have to make, including the President's escalation plan. So with that in mind, here is my thesis for today. When the President decided that we should go into Iraq, he did so in part on the justification that it was the central front in the war on terror, and that there was extensive connections between al-Qaeda and Iraq. We now know, and most Americans accept, that none of that was true then. We're now going to be told that we have to escalate in Iraq because whatever may have been the truth in the past, Iraq is now the central front in the war on terror. Perhaps they will even admit that we have made it the central front in the war on terror. And that unless we succeed there, that there is no way for us to be successful in the global war on terror. That isn't true either. That's my thesis today. Let me walk you through why I think it. So let's think about after Iraq. Freddie Clay, somebody who I trust is not often quoted here, Freddie Clay, former Undersecretary of Defense in the Reagan administration, wrote a great book, which we should all take out and dust off, called Every War Must End. The Iraq War will end for the United States someday. And when it does, what would we do to improve our struggle against fundamentalist Islamic terrorism? Well, first, what would we do in Iraq? Let's define the end of the Iraq War for the United States. Primarily, it means, for the United States, the withdrawal of U.S. combat troops. Someday there will be no U.S. combat units in Iraq. What will we do then? First in Iraq and then elsewhere, to address the threat from fundamentalist Islamic terrorism. What do we need in Iraq? The single most important thing the United States needs from its core national security interests is that Iraq not become, or might I say, no longer would be, a sanctuary for terrorists. It is today. That Iraq no longer be a training ground for terrorists, as it is today. Now, it would be nice if it were a democracy. It would be nice if it stayed a centralized, federated government. It would be nice if it exported oil. But the number one thing from a national security interest of the United States is that it not be a terrorist sanctuary. How, after we withdraw U.S. combat troops, whenever that is, how do we ensure that Iraq not become that kind of sanctuary? The way we do in other countries around the world. We try to work with the host government, and if that fails, we engage in intelligence operations. And if that fails in extremis, we might engage, as we apparently did yesterday in Somalia, in brief military operations. We can do all of that. From Kuwait, from Jordan. We can do it perhaps with the help of the future Iraqi government. Because any Iraqi government you can imagine coming into power, any central Iraqi government, is not going to want their country to be a terrorist sanctuary. And if I'm wrong about that, there are ways that we can deal with the lack of cooperation we might get from the Baghdad government. So we can achieve our major national security goal vis-a-vis Iraq without being there. In fact, being there makes it more difficult to achieve that goal. For by being there, we are attracting terrorists, and we are affording terrorists an opportunity to get trained by attacking U.S. and coalition forces. Beyond Iraq, what do we need in the global war on terrorism, in the struggle against fundamentalist Islamic terrorism after Iraq? Let me suggest that there are 4 areas that we need to make progress in. First, as the 9/11 Commission called it, the battle of ideas. Our struggle, the struggle of moderate Arabs and moderate Islamic countries around the world, the struggle of the United States and Europe against fundamentalist Islamic terrorism, is at base and at root an ideological debate. It's not caused by poverty. It's not caused by military activity. It's caused by a perversion of the Islamic religion by a small group of radical theologists. We need to counter them. We need our friends in the Islamic world to counter them, and we need to help them to do that. That's not a military struggle. It's not even an intelligence struggle. We are now unable to successfully participate in the battle of ideas in the Islamic world because the United States is discredited in the Islamic world. Country after country, poll after poll reveals that fact. So one of the things that the 9/11 Commission said was essential, we are unable to do because we are in Iraq. This battle of ideas needs to take place not only in the Middle East, but importantly in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and increasingly in Europe, where there's every reason to believe that a new generation of fundamentalist Islamic terrorists may be developing. A key element in the battle of ideas, not the only element, but a key element, is real progress in the peace process with Israel and Palestine. The administration says it has an initiative in the wings. I hope it does. But as we know from past experience, for real progress to take place, the United States administration, the White House, the President, needs to be fully engaged. And that's not possible while the President's attention, the White House's attention, is focused on the war in Iraq. The second area where we would want to focus is in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where al-Qaeda grew up, had its first sanctuary, started to affiliate with other terrorist groups. Old al-Qaeda, the bin Laden al-Qaeda that grew up there, is still alive. It is not strong. It is not a worldwide organization. It is not clearly running terrorist organizations and terrorist operations, although there's reason to believe it may have had a hand in some of the activities in Europe in the last 2 years. But other terrorist groups affiliated with al-Qaeda and having the same ideology are operating in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it's very clear to any observer that we have not achieved our goals in Afghanistan. We have not stabilized a centralized government. In fact, the Taliban is resurgent on both sides of the border. And U.S. military commanders fear that when the spring thaws come in Afghanistan and Pakistan, that there will be a renewed offensive. Already, Afghanistan has become a narco state. Under the Taliban, production of narcotics was down significantly, almost eliminated. Today, it is at an all-time high and is suppressing the price of heroin around the world. There's a glut of heroin around the world coming out of Afghanistan at a time when the United States and NATO occupy the country. We need to do much more in terms of economic development, alternative crops. We need to do much more to provide security in Afghanistan. None of that will go ahead with the level of effort required while we're in Iraq because of the funding requirements, because of the force requirements, and frankly, because of the attention requirements of doing that kind of operation. The number one thing we needed to do after 9/11, and obviously before 9/11, to stabilize Afghanistan and rid it of terrorists, has not been accomplished. So that's a second area where we need to turn our attention after Iraq. The third area is in strengthening the counterterrorism capabilities of regional states, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Horn of Africa. What we saw yesterday and for the last few weeks in the Horn of Africa is instructive. We have to give credit to the administration, but largely to the administration of Ethiopia, for making progress in the last few weeks in the Horn of Africa. Reports reaching us suggest that hundreds of al-Qaeda-related terrorists from Pakistan and Afghanistan, from Yemen, and from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere may have died in the combat against the Ethiopian army in the last few weeks. And yesterday, it's possible that a U.S. airstrike killed one of the leaders of the al-Qaeda cell that attacked the U.S. embassies in East Africa in 1998. That's significant progress. But it's not progress that can be sustained. The Ethiopian army cannot stay in Somalia. Because of regional resentments, they're not welcome there. Because of the fact that half of the people of Ethiopia are Christian, it could be characterized as a Christian occupation. So Ethiopia, for financial reasons and political reasons, now has to withdraw. Who will replace it? And who will pay for that? And who will orchestrate that? And who will provide the logistic support for that replacement? For that creation of a new peacekeeping force or stability force in Somalia? The United States can't orchestrate that, can't pay for it, can't provide the logistical support and the military support for it, because we are tied down in Iraq. And if no stability force goes in to Somalia, this victory in the struggle against fundamentalist Islamic terrorism will be short-lived, and Somalia will slip back into the chaos that it has slipped in and out of for the last 15 years. The fourth thing we need to do after Iraq is to reduce our remaining vulnerabilities here at home. Whether it's Islamic fundamentalist terrorists or some other form of terrorism that emerges over the next 20 years, we will probably see terrorism again in the United States. And many of the vulnerabilities that we identified in the late 1990s, many of the vulnerabilities that were identified by the 9/11 Commission, remain unaddressed. And even if the new Democratic Congress now passes the pending Homeland Security bill to implement the remaining recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, most of those vulnerabilities, those significant vulnerabilities, will still remain unaddressed. A serious piece of legislation on chemical plant security has not yet passed. A serious attempt to deal with radiological materials and nuclear materials both in the United States and around the world has not been launched. Our transportation system remains vulnerable. The major 14 subway and metropolitan rail systems remain vulnerable. And even if the funding change that the Democrats are proposing takes place, we will still not have a Homeland Security funding mechanism that is requirements-based, that says this is what we're going to achieve by this date. We will still be giving money to states to do with largely as they please. So, there are a lot of things that we can do, most of which we cannot do successfully at the level that we need to do while we're in Iraq. Because we don't have the money, because Iraq is taking all of the money, because we don't have the attention of the administration for these other issues, the sustained high-level attention to make things happen, and in many cases because we do not have adequate U.S. troops to perform the activities in Afghanistan and elsewhere. The longer we stay in Iraq, these issues will continue to fester. Many of these things that we need to do will become harder to do later on. In fact, they become harder to do every day when we don't address them. And so all of these things that we have to do to really address the serious problem of terrorism, the problem that was one of the excuses for going into Iraq, we cannot do while we are in Iraq. How does the way in which the Iraq War ends affect our ability to achieve all of these things? If we do now finally a counterinsurgency, as we know, counterinsurgencies take 7 years, 10 years to be successful, if they're ever successful. If we leave 10 years from now, 7 years from now, 3 years from now, how will that be different? How will that affect our ability to do all these other important things compared to if we left this year and next? I believe that in either case, whether the last U.S. combat force unit leaves 12 months from now, or 7 years from now, the result will be largely the same. In post-U.S. combat troop Iraq, there is likely to be chaos. There is likely to be a higher level of bloodshed. There is nothing much that we can do about that. Staying on longer won't significantly alter that outcome. Now, we as Americans don't like to hear that. We as Americans have a can-do attitude and think that if we just work harder, work smarter, spend more money, there will always be a good outcome, or at least not a bad outcome. In this case, we have to face the truth that there is going to be a bad outcome in Iraq no matter what we do. The administration has created circumstances in which there is no good outcome. But let's concede the possibility that if we stayed on for 3 or 5 years, that the post-U.S. Iraq chaos might be somewhat less. We don't know that that's true. There's really no reason to believe that. But let's concede it for the sake of argument. How much less? There's no way of knowing that either. And how much is it worth to us as the United States to have that slight difference in chaos? Is it worth another 3,000 dead Americans? Is it worth another 100,000 dead Iraqis? Is it worth another $500 billion? Is it worth our inability to do all of the things that we need to do to fight the war on terror? I think it's extremely unlikely that the difference in post-U.S. Iraq chaos is worth any of those things, let alone all of them. Will the chaos that does come about strengthen terrorism? Will it create a regional war? So that's one of the things we're hearing, that if we leave too soon, there will be a regional war. Now, I know that Iraq and Vietnam are very different, and most analogies between them fail. But it does strike me that this threat of the regional war is very similar to the domino theory in Iraq, in Vietnam. The domino theory in Vietnam was, as you recall, we were told that if the United States got out of Vietnam, all the other countries in Southeast Asia, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, would all fall to communist governments. It didn't happen. It was never going to happen. It couldn't have. And I find it very difficult to imagine the scenario where, because of increased chaos in Iraq, the Jordanian military, the Iranian military, the Saudi military, the Turkish military cross the border and start fighting each other. They're smarter than that. They're smarter than we are. They understand the region. They've lived there forever. None of those governments are going to introduce large military units to fight each other in Iraq. They may do what they're already doing, which is to involve their intelligence forces in supporting people inside Iraq. But the threat of some broader regional war, which is always undefined, which no one has ever said, here's the scenario, the realistic scenario for how we get there. The threat of some broader regional war is, I think, largely fictitious. In fact, when U.S. combat troops begin to leave, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, the Gulf states, may in fact be stimulated not to engage in war, but to step up diplomatic efforts inside Iraq and with factions in Iraq and with each other, with or without the United States, to find ways of reducing the chaos and creating stability. Thus, I think the Bush-McCain escalation plan delays the day when we can begin to seriously address the remaining threats from fundamentalist Islamic terrorism. And it makes it more difficult to achieve addressing those threats because it delays the day, and those threats get worse as a result. Why then do we think that Bush is proposing an escalation in Iraq? Because surely some of his advisors somewhere must have told him of an analysis like the one I have just given you today. I've thought about this a lot in the last few weeks, and I've come to the sad conclusion that the President's probably motivated by a desire to avoid or delay the judgment of history, to move the failure in Iraq into the next administration, so that when history writes of the failure in Iraq, he and his supporters will be able to say, well, it wasn't all our fault. After all, the failure occurred in the X administration, not in the Bush administration. They are unable to admit error. They are unable to admit failure. Bush reminds me, in doing this escalation, of a gambler who came to the table and was given a lot of chips and repeatedly made what at that time were foolish bets. What everyone looking on at the time knew were foolish bets. And he depleted all of those chips. And he's now left borrowing chips in a last double-down attempt at a very remote possibility of leaving the table with some chips, with some face. In order to save face, he is not only borrowing money, our grandchildren's money, by running up the debt, but he is also gambling with the lives of Americans. He's gambling with the lives of Iraqis. And he's gambling with U.S. national security. Thanks very much, and I'll be glad to take your questions. Yeah.
We've got microphones, so if you have a question for Dick, you can raise your hand.
Hi, my name is Sam Schneidman, and thank you for your candor this morning. I was just wondering if you still held your position as like terrorism czar, as you did in the Clinton administration. What would you advise President Bush to do regarding the situation in Somalia and the continued presence of al-Qaeda, not only in Somalia but also in the Horn of Africa region?
If I were still in the White House and the President asked me a question about terrorism in Somalia, the Horn of Africa, I would do then what I did in the past when that question came up in the White House. I would tell the President to call Gail Smith, which always worked because Gail knew the answer. I think the problem today is very different than it was a month ago because of what Ethiopia has done. And we have to give Ethiopia great credit for what it's done, and to the extent the United States was involved, and we don't know that full extent because some of it is classified and the administration hasn't yet been fully candid about everything it's done. By the way, now that U.S. military forces have been engaged in Somalia, there's a requirement under the War Powers Act that the administration file a report with the Congress outlining what it's done. So we may find out a little bit more, although that report can be classified in part. But it's a very different situation now that the fundamentalist Islamic terrorists, many of them have been killed, perhaps hundreds of them have been killed, some of them apparently been captured, and many of them are trying to get out of the country. The problem, as Gail reminded me this morning, is now what do you do to maintain that momentum? The Ethiopian army has to leave for political, economic, and military reasons. And when it does, if it is not replaced by a stability force, then Somalia will fall back into chaos in time. The stability force will require U.S. logistic support. It will require U.S. lift. It will require U.S. intelligence and communications support. It will require U.S. money. And it will require behind-the-scenes U.S. diplomatic efforts. I should let Gail be saying all this, because she said it this morning a lot better than this. We need to have those U.S. diplomatic efforts to build the stability force largely be behind the scenes, because we are so much anathema in the region and the broader region from which the stability force would be drawn. If we don't do that now, if we don't spend that money, find those military assets, which are going to be really hard to do because we're in Iraq, then this victory over the terrorists in Somalia will be short-lived.
Jay Bonstengel, thank you for your comments and for your insights. Is there anything that could be done after the war ends to rebuild the opinions that people around the world have of this country?
I think it is important that the United States be well thought of around the world, not because of any intrinsic value in that, but because we need to be well thought of so that governments around the world can help us in our various requirements and initiatives. And governments, frankly, and we were just talking about this with regard to the Somali Stability Force, governments around the world today feel they need to distance themselves from us. So it's important that the United States be well thought of around the world. And I think there's a lot we can do. Obviously, progress in the peace process will help a lot, particularly in the Islamic world, particularly in the Arab world. Beyond that, I think there are things we need to do to repair our standing by strengthening international institutions. We have given the world a good reason to believe that the United States no longer believes strongly in international institutions. In a global society, we have to strengthen those institutions because of the nature of the global economy and the global threats. Also, we have to strengthen them because it shares the burden of dealing with those threats. How do we do that? I think we need to do some things that would otherwise have been unpalatable. Things like the International Criminal Court. I've had my problems with the International Criminal Court concept from the start, but I think we now have to think about doing things like supporting it under certain circumstances and strengthening other such institutions so that we prove to the world that we are back as members of the international community.
Harlan Ullman from CSIS and a columnist with the Washington Times. My question has to do with your 4 actions, which I think everybody would agree with, and how you implement them. For the last 4 years, I have been working very closely with NATO commander and combatant commanders in Africa to try to implement exactly what you're describing. We have had monumental unsuccess, though we have gotten the attention of Don Rumsfeld and George Bush. So my question is simply this: what makes you think the U.S. government is remotely capable of implementing what you rightly suggest are things that need to be done irrespective of Iraq?
Well, I agree with you. The longer this administration goes on, the more I think that government in general is incapable of doing anything. But experience prior to this administration suggests it's possible. If you get the right people, if you give those issues the right sustained attention, and resource them appropriately. And it's got to be sustained attention. It's very easy for a president, a national security advisor, a secretary of defense, or secretary of state to dip into an issue for an hour and make a decision. And a week later, dip into that issue again for an hour to stand on a podium and make some remarks. But if there isn't a sustained follow-up, if there aren't milestones and goals and implementation reviews, and if you fail to adjust policy in order to achieve the outcome, then nothing happens. And this administration seems to have a philosophy largely based on public affairs. When it's forced to address an issue, it does some initiative, whether it's rebuilding New Orleans or something else, gives a nice speech, makes a lot of promises, and then there's absolutely no follow-up. And I think on the issues that you're talking about in Africa, if you properly resource them, if you cooperate with the Europeans and get them, persuade them to adequately resource them, and if you spend the time and attention on a sustained basis, you can achieve progress.
Thank you. My name is Ed Powers. I appreciate your comments, and I agree with virtually all of them. The point about Bush's motivation and pushing it off to the next administration, that certainly would not be the motivation of people like McCain and Lieberman and others who can be considered credible on most things. I'm not sure what their motivation would be. And their concern is not that, like yours, when we pull out, the difference will be slight. They argue that the difference will be monumental if we pull out too early. How does the public try and differentiate what is really the right thing to do at this point, since there seems to be credible people on all sides?
There is no way you can put into an econometric forecast what will happen in Iraq if you do X or Y. So we really don't know. And we have to be upfront about that. That we could be wrong because it's very hard to predict these things. So I think what you can do is to try to walk through scenarios that get you to various different outcomes and ask, how do you get there? So we have this concept out there of the broader regional war. Well, let's back up from the broader regional war and try to connect where we are today, which we do know, the broader regional war, which we can posit and define, and then see how you get from one to the other, and then judge whether or not that's very credible. I've tried that. I've tried that several times. I've asked other people who I respect, who know the region much better than I do, and I can't find anyone who can come up with a credible scenario that gets us from where we are today to the broader regional war. You know, I respect Senator McCain, I respect Senator Lieberman. I just think they're wrong about this. But they reflect a very American response, which is we think if we try harder, spend more money, get smarter people involved, that we can make anything work. And there are some situations in the world where that's not true. And the Bush administration has managed to create one.
Mr. Clarke, Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. I want to ask you a question about how, let me begin the question by saying that the scenario that you described, the double down, betting more than the ranch, is accurate. That Bush will do tomorrow night what we know he's going to do. The question that I'm interested in is what steps do you think are politically likely that could be taken, if not to forestall the president's recommendation, but to deal with that period that we might describe as the period that falls after the surge begins, and the period of time that you're talking about, which is after the war is over. I mean, what do we do here?
Well, I think one thing we have to recognize about a surge or an escalation, whatever we want to call it, is that it is not a single point in time decision. It's a decision that has to be renewed on a regular basis. There are military units that every few months come up for withdrawal. And the decision has to be made whether or not to replace them. So decisions are constantly being made about force levels in Iraq. And I think what we need to do is find ways of communicating the will of the American people. The Gallup poll today suggests that 61% of the American people think an escalation is wrong. Maybe after the President's speech tomorrow night, that number will drop to 50% temporarily. That's usually the way it works. But the overwhelming judgment of the American people and the overwhelming judgment of the Congress, including many Republicans, is that this is wrong. If we can sustain a campaign to say that and to explain why in detail, then I think it may be possible for the administration over the months after they decide to do the escalation to begin backing off. There will be decisions that they can make at monthly intervals to drop force levels here and there, not to keep people for longer periods of time, not to send people back who just were there. I think there's a lot that can be done for the administration to save face on this decision. It's hard for them to save face on the decision to go into Iraq in the first place. But if they go ahead and make this escalation decision, if the public and the Congress communicates on a sustained basis their opposition, and if it's clear it's not going to get anywhere in the long term, then I think the administration may be able to save face in 6 months and 9 months and begin drawing that number back down.
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Thank you. Patrick Hiker, CBS News. You said before that we're in a war of ideas. If that's true, don't we run the risk of providing al-Qaeda with further ideological proof that we, like the Soviet Union, don't have the political will or strength to oppose them anywhere, including our own country?
Yeah, this is the notion that I find troublesome, that if we leave Iraq, al-Qaeda will be strengthened in its opposition to the United States, that a U.S. withdrawal will strengthen al-Qaeda. If a U.S. withdrawal is otherwise in our interest, which it is, then maybe we have to pay that price. Number one. Number two, I talked a little while ago about the difference in chaos in Iraq and our inability to measure it looking into the future. The difference in al-Qaeda's ferocity against the United States, if we withdraw or if we don't withdraw, is so small as to be unmeasurable. Al-Qaeda doesn't need any more strengthening in its ferocity against the United States. And so if we leave, they will have a party, fine. That's not a reason to stay. If you make a mistake, the fact that and you then choose to correct it, the fact that your enemies may celebrate your mistake is not a reason not to correct it.
We've got time for one last question. I'd like to go to the gentleman behind the camera there, right near your page. But with the caveat that given the tremendous interest we've had in this event, and Dick, the insightfulness of your comments, I will secure from Mr. Clarke a pledge to come back before he leaves the building. Please go ahead.
Do you have the keys to my car? Or
Thank you. My name is Robert Lanza. There is currently a carrier group in the Persian Gulf, and the Bush administration just appointed an admiral as the senior commander for the Middle East region. Could you comment on that with respect to the administration's policy towards Iran?
Yeah, I've seen that speculation, and I think it's very overblown. The United States has had a carrier battle group in the Persian Gulf every day of the year since 1990. So that's having a carrier battle group there is not a surprise. Sometimes we've had two, and we're about to have two again, and that's not that unusual. We've even had four at one time. It may be an attempt to signal Iran. I have no problem with that. The appointment of a Navy admiral to run CENTCOM is a first because it's traditionally been a Marine or an Army general. But it is in keeping with the appropriate decision that the President and the Pentagon have made that all of the major combatant commands can be headed by someone from any service. And so we have seen over the course of the last couple of years combatant commands that were traditionally run only by one service in terms of the commander be opened up to all Marines, Navy, Army, Air Force. And I think that's fine, because by the time you become a 4-star in the United States military, you have gone through enough training and preparation that you can run any of the combatant commands. And I don't think the fact that he's from the Navy suggests anything. I think it just means that there's a broader talent pool that the Pentagon is now looking at when it makes these decisions, and that's a good thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chief.
Would it be possible to get a copy of your speech?
Very good one.
Will this be broadcast?